and we're going to be talking about art and music, two great things to talk about. In the studio with you this morning, I've got the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra music director, Alexander Mickelthwate, his second home away from home. He's got many homes away from home. And then we've also got Stephen Borys, the Winnipeg Art Gallery director and CEO. So I want to say good morning to you both. Good morning.
Good morning.
As they lean in, they're sharing the microphone. It's almost like a rock concert, isn't it? Where you both have to lean in and share the microphone, isn't it? Kind of where we're talking about music.
I know, it's really have to get used to that.
Yeah. So anyway, welcome to the studio. Great to have you guys here this morning. We're talking about the collaboration between the two organizations, the Winnipeg Art Gallery and the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra. Let's swing the microphone over to Stephen for 1 second. Stephen, when did all this begin? When did you guys start talking about collaborating the two organizations? How did that all come about?
Well, we've been collaborating for several years now. In fact, it was Andrew who came to me to talk about the new music festival. So we've done a bit of work there. At times our curators have gone over and given talks. Mm-hmm. But when Chagall came, the Daphnis and Chloe, Alexander had some great ideas. And anticipating of their fall program, there's some great overlap in terms of late 19th century, 20th century art and music, overlapping not just in terms of the dates, but in terms of artists and composers that were influenced by each other and certainly responded to different types of work.
Now you're referring in particular to Impressionism, some of the artists from Impressionism that they're going to be doing, Winnipeg Symphony is going to be doing. So tell us about your, where the WAG comes in for the impressionistic side of things artistically.
Well, it's interesting. You could consider Chagall an impressionist, but of course he's too late. But he comes out of a tradition of great French modernism. And of course that is based on the Impressionists in the last decades of the 19th century. And if you look at his paintings, they're all about color. They're all about impressions. They're about movements, kind of nuances of light and color. And if you look at some of the works that were produced in the early part of the 20th century, they actually respond and align with the very thing that the Impressionist painters were doing.
Mm-hmm. So where does the music thing come in, Alexander? When we talk about Impressionist composers, you got Fauré, Debussy, Ravel. Where does the word impressionism come in with these composers?
Well, I mean, the word impressionism comes from your side, right? Monet.
Right, Monet.
So
Monet,
it was the guy who actually the title of one of the paintings was, I think, that way. Well, I mean, the music side is of course huge. As during the 19th century, composers slowly shifted, and well, in France, that was somehow suddenly a new language that was extremely exciting. But the interesting thing is, the inspiration came from Wagner. So Wagner's Tristan specifically, and we are going to perform the second act of Wagner's Tristan, was one of those pieces that completely changed music history. And that famous Tristan chord, this ambiguous harmony that kind of was like half death, half life, was like a shadow harmony that resembled really the colors of that like a somewhat dream world of Impressionist painters. And Debussy was extremely fascinated and influenced by that, and was a big Wagner fan and took those ideas and then continued this direction.
Yeah, because Wagner's considered a more romantic
of course,
composer,
yeah.
But he was almost the precursor.
But was a precursor of Impressionism.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, and then, of course, we now perform in this festival. We do La Mer, Debussy's La Mer, and it's really like a tone painting that is basically what you have in Monet's paintings. I mean, this is then on like a audible canvas, you know. And
audible canvas.
An audible canvas.
Quote unquote, an audible canvas.
You can quote that.
I will.
Mickelthwate said.
Should do it.
Yes.
Anyway, yeah.
Well, speaking of audible canvas, one of the things you guys are doing next year, all the pieces you mentioned are coming up in the next season, 2016,
right.
2017 season. One of the things you're doing next year is you're going to be performing a piece, and you're going to be in the background. I'm assuming, I was trying to understand, are going to be screened images of some of the works from Chagall, correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea, that we kind of create some more synergies in the Impressionist Festival. And I actually, for me, it's a learning curve because I thought always Chagall was more impressionist than he is, but he is. And you mentioned it, and so that's the fantastic thing about this collaboration, that Steve can give more background and connections. So,
Yeah, Stephen. So you want to comment on the collaboration next year with the images they're going to be using? Is it?
I think it's amazing. It's really just part of the bigger picture. And a few weeks ago when we opened Chagall, Alexander came over and performed some works by Debussy.
Yes. Yeah.
So it was wonderful, but for the audience, for those, when we did the media preview, to be sitting in this room with all these Chagalls on the wall and to hear this music, then they understand the power of this overlap. And music and art, the visual and the performing arts, have always been connected, but there's a period in the 19th century and early 20th century where they're actually quite aligned, even in terms of the chronology and the dates. And even though Impressionism is really a painting movement, you do have these composers that we refer to as impressionistic. And if you think of what they're coming out of, and Alexander mentioned Wagner, and you think of Romanticism, you think of realism, Impressionism is really a response to what was going on, a reaction. And many of these artists were kicked out of the salon, the formal academies, because of the works they were doing. Their works were not accepted. So they decided, let's organize our own exhibitions, and they were titled by they were named by the critics the Impressionists. They didn't come up with that name. And I think of the music that Alexander's talking about, tone poems, phrasing, the type of chromatic, the type of, how would you say, harmonies. The Impressionists are simply trying to capture an impression. That's all they're doing. They're not trying to document something that's realistic, whether it's the light, whether it's the clouds, whether it's a train, a bridge, a field, a stormy day. They're capturing it with light and color and brushwork. And I think you see some of these same intentions with these artists. And Debussy, and you think of the subjects they're using, the sea or land or fields or air, these are all totally aligned with the Impressionists in terms of what they wanted to document.
I'm in the studio with Stephen Borys, the Winnipeg Art Gallery director and CEO, and Alexander Mickelthwate, the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra director. And we're chatting about the collaborations between the WAG and the WSO, which, as Stephen said earlier, have happened many times in the past. It's sort of a bit more of a formal, I guess, a little bit now, where they're going to be doing things for the 2016-2017 season with the WSO. So what kind of things do you guys have planned? I know we talked briefly, without, as I said off-air, Stephen, without sort of giving away anything that hasn't been announced, what kind of things can we expect between the two organizations? Alexander.
Well, first of all, I must say it was for me personally literally a highlight to perform at the opening of the Chagall exhibit. So it was so special to me personally. Yeah. Because usually, you play in a concert hall, and here you have this beautiful artwork around, and if you haven't seen it, you have to see it. It's like everybody out there. It's unbelievable paintings and prints, and it's a complete, fantastic visual world for me personally. So that Debussy then, I played Sweetback Masque, like Clair de Lune was one of the movements. I'm sure many of you know that out there. And it is a language that, it's just an impression. It was really nice how you explained that, Stephen. So in this case, the moon. And an impression of it. And it kind of goes deeper. It's more emotional, I think. And now in the 2 weeks in October, when we perform 3 different concerts, everything from, as I mentioned, Debussy La Mer, there will be Daphnis and Chloe, the Ravel version. And here now, again, the correspondence now at the WAG, the Chagall, Daphnis and Chloe, absolutely stunning. You have to see it. And, the idea is now that then Stephen gives this whole visual background on the one side, and that we do try to show some images, and we're still working on that. That again, it's all connected, and I think this was the beautiful thing of Paris. I guess at least in the beginning of the last century, where the arts people were just in those salons together. But can you talk about this? Like, how was it at that time?
I think at the last quarter of the 19th century, art making, whether it's music or whether it's painting or printmaking, was taking place everywhere. In the academies, in the salons, the studios. You'd have these café concerts. You'd have all of this overlap in terms of writers, artists, composers. And in fact, they're influencing each other. So it's a really exciting time. The fact that it's taking place in Paris is interesting. And then what's happening with color theory, what's happening with photography, the impact on how they're looking at things. And then the buildup, believe it or not, of the great train lines to the country. So now people in Paris could go out to the countryside for a day. And this is also the second generation of artists that were painting en plein air. So they're painting out of doors rather than in their studio. So they're impacted in a very different way in terms of sunlight. And it's all coming together. So it's incredible. And we know that music is really the most abstract of the arts. But when two people are standing in front of a painting, you can say, at least unless you're colorblind, that's orange, that's yellow, that's a tree. But when you're listening to a work of music and you're sitting next to someone in the concert hall, you don't know exactly what they're reading or hearing. So to add images to it is exciting. And to add images that actually are aligned at the time, I think is important. That you could actually create a palette against Debussy or Ravel with images that actually they would have understood or embraced. And so it's a legitimate pairing as opposed to something forced. And that's what I think is, I'd love to do this, come up with the fabulous canvases that these artists would have seen in their day and that they would have understood. Those painters are trying to do the same things we're doing by documenting, capturing something, a moment, an idea, an impression, atmospheric elements. Monet loved the fog. And how do you capture fog in a painting? And how do you capture fog or sounds in a work of music or the changing day? Alexander could talk about that.
Yeah, it's kind of like just the right wine with the right food. They kind of pair up so well together. And we just have a couple more minutes. So I wanted to wrap up. We're talking about the Chagall, and the Chagall exhibit is what's on now at the Winnipeg Art Gallery. Winnipeg has always been known as sort of a cultural hub, and when we kind of forget some of the important things and some of the connections we have. And there's a connection with Chagall and Winnipeg, it's been in the news a lot lately, but just give me a few brief words about the connection with Chagall and Winnipeg. Because Marc Chagall is one of my favorite painters of all time, and just that, he has a connection to Winnipeg is pretty amazing.
Yes, well, Chagall, this Russian-born French artist, Jewish artist, spent most of his time in France. But he met, this would have been in the 50s, he met Dr. Ferdinand Eckhart, the director of the WAG. And the two couples, Chagall and Vava, and Dr. Eckhart, Ferdinand, and his wife, Sophie, met a few times. And they met in the south of France. They corresponded. When there were opportunities to connect in Europe, they were there. And so you see this kind of impact. And of course, Eckhart's wife's first husband painted Chagall's wife. And so there's all these interesting overlaps. And so to have here in Winnipeg Chagall's Daphnis and Chloe is pretty exciting. The fact that Dr. Eckhart loved this artist. And you're seeing an artist, with the exception of Matisse, in terms of color in the 20th century, no one ever comes close to the way he's able to use color on the canvas. Even Picasso said his paintings were like throwing together colors. So it's an exciting time for Winnipeg. It's a perfect summer show. The works are beautiful. The story, this amazing love story between Daphnis and Chloe, which is based on a Greek story from the 2nd century, is beautiful. And the fact that an artist in the 20th century can put images to the text, and then composers can put music to the text, it's powerful. And the fact that they're not perfectly overlapped with the program this fall with the WSO, I think it's wonderful that audiences this summer can see Daphnis and Chloe at the WAG. This fall, they'll come to the WSO and they'll see another interpretation of this famous story.
Well, Alexander, I'll give you the last word. Tell me about the Ravel the Daphnis and Chloe. I'm going to play a little sample from it right after.
Yeah, I mean, the Ravel, first of all, since I'm here, since my 10 years, every year we try to say, okay, this year we're doing the Ravel, Daphnis and Chloe. No, this year. Never worked out. It's a 50-minute work. It's a major work. You know, it's important work of Ravel. And it's in 2 parts. There's a women's female choir at the end. It's a very difficult, actually, just technically difficult work for the orchestra. And he is really able to create that like a soundscape that is so extremely lush and romantic. And although I feel like some might not know the music, it's one of those works that is somehow sticks in your subconscious, and I think everybody knows it somehow. So it will be a really big undertaking for us to do that, and we'll delve more into detail, of course, than in that week, and find out more connections. But so it's great to have this collaboration, and for me personally, Ravel is also the one who, I mean, he wrote La Valse, he wrote several wonderful works that we have done before. It's very accessible on one level, and I feel like Impressionist almost doesn't cut it, because Impression is just this little, it seems like a little impression, and here you have this like a waterfall of impression, you know, whoosh. So it will be a real
heavier emotion. Heavier emotion. Big emotion.
Impression.
Well, I'm sure you guys will be up to the task. I look forward to hearing that next season, and look forward to seeing what you guys have in store for us in the coming little while. So again, we were talking about the 2016-2017 season. Go to wso.ca for information on that season, and there's some great Impressionist works, among others as well. Joshua Bell coming to town. And then also get out to see the Chagall exhibit at the WAG. Again, one of my favorite painters, and I look forward. I haven't been out there yet, but I'm going. It's on my plans, so I'll be there. So again, thank you guys for coming in this morning. It's been a pleasure to chat with you.
Thank you so much.